crested geckos, like this little fella here, Mr. Okira Schaefer, or Mr. Cipher for short. Having once thought to be extinct, crested geckos since their rediscovery have become one of the staple animals within the reptile industry. They make very popular pets, and their ease of care has a lot to do with that. They also breed quite prolifically and with minimal effort, so that's got to contribute as well. Now these guys can fire up and down their color like a chameleon. It's not a complete color change. Right now he's kind of neutral, but he can darken up quite a bit as well. So if you see that happening with your crested gecko, there's nothing to be concerned about. You can also see, looking at the base of where his tail was here, he's got this little nub, this little bulge. A lot of lizards can do something called tail autotomy, where they will drop their tail to freak out predators and distract them so that the gecko can make a getaway. Most geckos can regenerate a tail in between 1 and 3 months after the fact. Crested geckos cannot. This is a get-out-of-jail-free card. They drop that tail once, and then the tail is gone. Crested geckos, like most geckos, don't actually have a blinking eyelid. They've instead got a cap over their eye, and therefore they need to lick those eyes to keep them, clean and free of debris and functional. But they're pretty cool little guys. Let's dive into what you need to know to take care of them. So what we have here is a bioactive enclosure. This one's a bit of an off-brand. You're probably more familiar with the Exoterras or the Zoomeds. And we've actually got a Madagascar day gecko in there, but there are a lot of parallels in between the care. So we're looking at a vertical enclosure. These are arboreal animals, meaning that they like to spend a lot of time high up and in the trees and climbing. You do want to make sure your enclosure accommodates the space of the animal quite well. If you've just got an itty-bitty little Exoterra, that's going to become quite cramped for an adult one of these guys. This is Mick Jr. He's our lily white crested gecko with heterochromia, and he's here to help us talk about the way you want to lay out your structures in your crested gecko enclosure. So this one here is not bioactive. This one's a little bit more basic. I haven't gotten to bioing it yet, and you might notice there's no fancy lights on this enclosure. That is another one of the great things about crested geckos, is if you supplement their diet appropriately, you don't necessarily need UV lights for them. And if you in fact do decide to use UVB, which can be beneficial to most forms of life, you do want to make sure you're not using one that's too powerful, that's going to make them too crispy, because that's no good. You also might notice I don't have a heat lamp on here. In the average household, your room temperature, 75 some odd degrees, is going to be appropriate for these guys. There will be little microclimates inside this environment that they can access. But unless your enclosure is really, really big, or your house is really, really cold, you don't want to really utilize a heat source, because that can these guys can overheat a lot easier than they can get too cold. But we can see our structure laid out here. We've got plenty of fake plants in this case, but in a bio they'd be real. And these are places to hide, they are stimulation, and also when we mist the enclosure down, they're going to be places where water droplets can build up that the gecko can then drink from, because we don't really give our crested geckos water bowls for the most part. Although that could be something you do as long as you're keeping it super clean. They're going to drink most of their water as droplets on their structures. Now if we move this aside, we can see there's all sorts of cork bark forming out a foundation here. There's surfaces that are both flat to rest on and vertical for climbing as well. You want to make sure you have both of those things, and plenty of them. If you have a large enclosure with one stick in it, that's actually not a lot of surface area for an animal that exists in a omnidirectional sort of fashion. You want to make sure that you have things going in all sorts of directions and filling as much of that space as possible. In order to maintain that humidity, you want to mist these guys down once or twice a day. I prefer once in the morning and once in the evening, but it also depends on the humidity within your building. Our shop here is super duper humid. If I mist them down twice, that's too much. Things get a little stagnant and nasty. So in the average household, things are a lot drier. Misting down twice is going to be a-okay. Or you can utilize an automated misting system. Mist King makes a lovely one. That will mist your enclosure for you. Just make sure you dial in your timer on those things, because you don't want to flood your enclosure out either. Now when you're caring for vertically oriented animals, you're going to get vertically oriented messes. For example, in our Leachianus gecko enclosure, we can see Mossball decided to take a nice big bowel movement all the way down his front glass here. And even though this is a bioactive enclosure and the feces that hit the ground are very effectively being cycled by little isopods like that guy there, and keeping the plants growing, isopods cannot scale glass the same way the geckos can. And so that has to be manually cleaned. You can use a couple different things to do this. A common cleaner that is used is 1 part vinegar, 10 part water, and that can sparkle things up quite nice. But here we use something called trifectant, and if I could look at where I put it, there it is. It's also called Virkon. It's just a veterinarian grade animal safe cleaner that works quite well. So those surfaces you still gotta tend to by your lonesome. One of the things that makes caring for New Caledonian geckos so easy is their food. This is ZooMed gecko food. It's literally just a pre-made formula that you add water to, and you mix it together to make this little sort of, what would you call it, applesauce consistency. We have these frozen here, and we've got 2 of them because Leachianus geckos are big, and thus they have large tummies. Oh, shoot. That's another reason we freeze them. Right, buddy? As you can see, after a day or 2 goes by, this food gets kind of nasty. So you do want to make sure you're replacing it frequently. Every other day is sort of our average here. Humidity is another super important factor to bear in mind with these animals. These are a semi-tropical animal. They come from a faraway land called New Caledonia off of Australia, primarily on the Isle of Pines. And this is sort of a temperate rainforest, I suppose. I don't know my biomes well, but I've got a lovely image in my head, and I'm going to flash an image up on the screen here that you can take a look at as a point of reference. We always try to emulate their natural environment in our enclosures as best we can, but that can be a challenge sometimes. But just do your best, honestly. One of the major perks about crested geckos is their handleability. As you've seen with Mr. Cypher and McJr. so far, they're pretty hands-on critters. Once they're tamed down, you can pick them up without too much trouble. They're not going to give you too much hassle, usually. This beautiful boy, for example, is Count Chocula II, and he looks like he's behaving right now, but the second he thinks he can get away with it, he's either going to take off on me like a bat out of hell, or he's going to start biting me to assert his dominance. He's a bit of a funky fellow. These guys all have varying personality, so I can't tell you exactly how your crested gecko is going to handle, but they all handle a little different. Crested geckos have some pretty unique adaptations, like the Spider-Man adaptation here. These guys can cling to sheer surfaces like glass using the power of science. Now there's a whole bunch of stuff going on that lets them do that, and we're not really going to go through that because that would be a whole video on its own using a whole bunch of physics I don't really understand. But they are pretty grippy little fellas, and they'll climb right up your walls and on your ceiling if they get away from you. Fortunately, they're not that fast, and they're not that smart, so they probably will not break your line of sight, and they should be easy enough to recollect should they do this. Yoink. Like most other reptiles, New Caledonian geckos like this gargoyle gecko here are going to shed their skin periodically. Unlike some others, they will eat that skin as well. They don't want to lose those nutrients or leave a whole bunch of evidence as to where they are behind for predators. Kind of comes off like a little onesie. And if we look real close on Lump's head here, we see an ear hole, which is a commonality amongst lizards, but these guys actually have pretty good hearing. You also see those slitty eyes. That indicates this is a nocturnal or crepuscular critter, active at night or dawn or dusk. Anywho, point being, what separates geckos, specifically, from other lizards, is the fact that they have functioning vocal cords and can actually vocalize rather than just hiss or huff. They can squeak and shout. So if you have a male especially and you set it up in enclosure in your bedroom, it might be pestering you a little bit at nighttime, but it's not so bad. They sound kind of cute. Now, you may have noticed that we've been bouncing away from crested geckos quite a bit and looking at some others. Oh! For example, the gargoyle gecko and the Leachianus gecko. And this really fast Chahua gecko. Now, I'm covering all of these because New Caledonian geckos all have very, very similar care to them. Obviously, the larger the gecko, the larger a space you need to accommodate them, but they eat the same diet, they require similar humidity, similar temperatures. Some of them like more crickets than others, but you can feed them all crickets. You just want to make sure you're dusting them up with some good calcium. Calcium without vitamin D3 if you're using a UV light, and if you're not using a UV light, you want to make sure that calcium has the vitamin D3 on there. And then there's also, where are you going, bud? There's also the Saracenoran geckos. These are the closest relative of cresties of all the things we've looked at today, and they're just like a real big, long, slender crestie. Curiously enough, despite the fact that crested geckos cannot regrow their tails once they lose them, these other Caledonian geckos all can. It's kind of interesting. Anywho, I think we've got all of our basics covered here. We've got feeding, temperatures, humidity, enclosure size, and the basic way you want to set things up. If you want to know more specifics about how the bioactive enclosures work, we have touched on that in other videos, and I'd be happy to make more content regarding those as well. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and until then, we will see you next time.